Thank you for joining us.
I know we had people. Where did they go? Nick scared them away.
Okay, we're gonna start the planning commission meeting for Tuesday, June 4th, 2019. Everybody stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right. Item number 2, audience comments. Are there anybody in the audience that wants to talk about something that's not on the agenda tonight? That would be you. You have anything? He is on a list?
Pastor Virgil is here for one of the hearing items.
Okay, all right. So moving on to number 3, business items. A, public hearing for sexually violent predator housing permanent ordinance.
Okay, just to go through this briefly, this was discussed with the Planning Commission at last month's meeting. The City Council adopted an interim ordinance for sexually violent predator housing, as this was not something that had been addressed in the city's code previously. In fact, it had not really been on the radar of our local jurisdictions at all. And so this was something that was triggered in response to housing in North Kitsap that was transitional sexually violent predator housing placed in a residential neighborhood with limited notice and permit processing by the local jurisdiction, by the county. And so most of the local jurisdictions are either working on ordinances or have adopted them in response to this issue. And so the one that we've adopted is consistent with state law, has been approved by the city attorney, and we are just looking at making this permanent, no changes from what was adopted as the interim ordinance. And so we are asking you to review this and provide a recommendation of approval to the council tonight. And we will have this enacted into the code probably by July. And what this does is this just basically says that this type of housing should be limited in where it goes. It should not be in a residential neighborhood. It should not be near a school, a playground, other areas where children are playing. Should not be near a domestic violence shelter, other things like this. There are also provisions in here to protect the persons who are located within this housing. It requires them to, the developers of this housing, they must have certain fire and access provisions within that housing because they are secured. And so that was another issue that had come up in the housing in North Kitsap, was that they did not actually have a way for those people to escape correctly if there was a fire or other emergency. So we want to make sure that both the neighborhood is protected and the individuals in the housing are protected. So we hope that this will be something that is a benefit to both the citizens of Port Orchard and to the people who are being served by this housing. And I'll be happy to answer any questions about this at this time.
So, can you give me an example of if it's not in residential area, the housing, where would it might be?
In the use table, which is attached to the ordinance, it's on page 2 of the use table at the very top. Mm-hmm. And it's under secured high-risk social services facilities because that is the way that the state defines it. And it will be allowed in the commercial corridor, commercial high, industrial flex, and light industrial zones. Again, taking it out of residential neighborhoods.
I just wonder, in commercial though, I didn't think that you could live there or stay there.
It's actually considered an institutional facility.
Okay, okay, so even if there's just one person or it has to be more than one? I mean, what's the limit on that?
As far as I know, there's not an actual numerical limit.
So I guess I should say, what's the minimum? So one person could live?
Yes. In the facility that was in North Kitsap, there were 4.
Okay. So you could build like a house in a commercial area for this?
I suppose it could look like a house.
It's commercial
Except that-
building code.
Yeah, I mean, you could make it look nicer than a commercial building or more home-like. I'm just kind of extrapolating because this hasn't come up as an actual issue. I don't know if Nick
I would
wants to speak
expect
to
it
it.
to look more like an assisted living facility or some other type of care facility.
Okay.
More so than a single
Which is
family.
fine, I just didn't, I'd have always thought you couldn't live in a commercial area like that, so. And so I'm good with it, I just was wondering where it might be. All right,
I've got a couple questions.
okay.
Carrie, under section 4, 2039, 122, 2 subpart B, I guess it would be,
I'm sorry, under section 4,
2039, 122, section 2, subsection B. It talks about landowners within half a mile radius being notified. Is half a mile, almost doesn't seem like it's enough. Is that a state requirement? Is that a number that's fixed? Can we increase it?
I'm not sure. I would have to discuss that with the city attorney. Normally, I would say there's not a problem of increasing it. There's just minimums that we would have to abide by. But in this case, this is considered a service that if we make it too onerous and then you can't place it anywhere, that could result in a problem. I don't think that notice would actually trigger that problem, but I would like to talk to the city attorney about that before saying that if we expanded it to 2 miles or 5 miles, that wouldn't create an issue.
Right. Yeah, just a half mile doesn't seem large enough a span to notify the people in the area.
I will check with the city attorney on that and email everyone back with her response.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I would actually be concerned with, half a mile is a pretty big radius for any kind of notification. I mean, our typical is like a 300-foot notification. I think that the risk you have of increasing it beyond a half mile is, number one, it could be on the other side of town across Blackjack Creek or a pretty good distance away, and somebody's going to get a notice. They're not going to know where it is. It's going to frighten them, and they're going to come in asking questions. And I think that we want to let people who are reasonably affected know, but you know, our city's a little less than 10 square miles, and you know, we're going to be notifying 10 or 20% of the city in some instances, and that's a lot of notices to go out and a lot of interest that gets stirred up, maybe unnecessarily.
I guess what I'm picturing is, because it's allowed in the industrial, what if it goes in, pretend, the industrial park and half-mile radius? I'm not sure you're going to capture anybody because there isn't much in the way of, I don't know. I'll defer to you guys. I mean, you know best.
It's one of the things we're trying to do is to take them out of where people are living. I see your point, though, that it's also not that we're trying to sneak them in so that no one gets notice. So I can discuss that kind of conundrum with Sharon and see what she thinks is the best approach, which is also legal.
Okay.
Okay.
Fair enough. Thank you. And then just one other comment.
I was back there, did we?
So also under 2039, 122, but on the next page. Basically the last, I guess it would be subsection H, or subsection I. Talking about the facility having backup power sufficient to energize the safety and security system in the event of a power outage. Is it possible to include in there for the duration of the power outage?
We wouldn't know how long the power outage would last, but how could we word this?
As opposed to.
You could say a specific number of hours, but I mean, if you're going to provide a backup generator, presumably it's going to have capacity to last.
We would hope, but what if it's just a little Honda generator out in the garage or something? You know?
I didn't even know it's on.
I know, whisper quiet.
What this is doing is it's not running the entire building. So it's not running the lights and the air conditioning and the refrigerators. It's simply to make them able, both to be contained and to be able to exit. So this is more of an emergency backup power system. So the safety and security systems, I think that's all this is really meant to address. If you think that it should address something in addition, this is another thing I can discuss with Sharon.
No, I see it's the benefit, because you don't want the power to go out and the door suddenly to unlock.
Exactly.
But-
Or for there to be a fire in the building and they lock and you can't get out.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes, right. I agree.
So all of the people who are in this facility, just to kind of put this in context, they all wear ankle monitors, GPS monitors, and they all have to be accompanied one-on-one by their, I don't want to call it their jailer, their caretaker, their companion, who is legally responsible for them. So I would, again, I'm not speaking for this facility, but their responsibility in the case of an emergency would be to get that person out of the facility and remain with them, and to take them to an appropriate law enforcement facility.
Okay,
That's my understanding.
right.
Do we have to allow them at all?
Yes, we do. It's considered one of the essential public facilities under state law that you cannot just ban.
Has anyone attempted to establish such an institution here, or is this only in response to what's going on in North Kitsap?
No, I think we have one at the industrial park already, don't we?
Not that I'm aware of.
I'm not sure if that's,
The
I
treatment
know we have a
center?
work release, but that's not the same thing.
maybe it is something
Work
different.
release is something different.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not positive.
Okay.
So are these like a single person gets released from jail and comes back to stay with his mom?
No, these are people who are habitual and dangerous sexual offenders who are considered to really not be capable of release in the future. They're going to need to be in a residential facility, not living on their own at any point. It's not considered to be a transitional facility. They're not going to be unsupervised release into the community. They're not out working jobs.
So it's ones that come like from McNeil Island?
Yes, yes. The people in North Kitsap, my understanding is they did come from McNeil, which is overcrowded, and they were ordered to find other housing for them.
So it didn't stop running 3 hours later and the doors unlocked.
So going back to the landowners, or the notification, is there any reason why we wouldn't want to contact more than just the landowners? I mean, I understand where the idea of where a facility might be located. There may not be residents necessarily, but there might be building occupants, people that might regularly be there. Would we want to notify more than just landowners? Like
I mean,
tenants?
there's no database for mailing anything to tenants. We just don't, there's nothing that would be complete. There could be a newspaper.
So minimally.
posting. Yeah.
Okay.
The only other thing we could do, I suppose we could send out postcards to occupant at this address.
So similar to what we do with other notifications.
Yeah.
Okay, is there any other questions right now? Okay, so at this time, I'm gonna open up the public hearing for sexually violent predator housing permanent ordinance. Does anybody have any comments? Seeing none, I'll close the public hearing. And do you want us to vote on it? Or no? What are we doing?
Do you feel that it sounded like you had a number of questions that you would like to have answered by the city attorney before making a recommendation? Did I hear that correctly? Okay.
That would be nice.
Then I will come back with the answers to your questions, and you may want to consider this at another planning commission meeting.
Yeah, so I think you would want to make a motion to continue this to the July meeting. Or is
Yep.
that too formal for?
This is a 6-month interim emergency ordinance that was adopted in April, so there is enough time for you to consider it at the next meeting.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Also, Pastor Virgil is here for the rezones, which I believe is last on the list, so just, you may want to take it out of order, just so he doesn't have to sit here for everything that we're discussing tonight.
We like visitors, though.
Interesting, isn't it?
Okay, we will move on
Hold
to.
on. Carrie, just regarding that, the emergency power and duration, if you guys could chat with the attorney about that as well, if there's some sort of standard number that can be put in there, you know, as opposed to duration of or X number of hours, just something.
Oh, for the generator, for the
Yeah,
backup
just to ensure
power?
it's not a small generator that only lasts for 3 hours and runs out of fuel.
Okay, I will ask her about that as well, just to see if there's any, or I don't know if we have, do we have for institutional facilities anything like that for the jail?
There might
or-
be something in a building code
Okay.
related to other building types, but
Okay,
we have to research it.
okay.
That'd be the fire department that would make that kind of decision?
No?
No, I think that'd be building. Do we need to make a motion to continue it to the next meeting?
That's the proper way to do it.
To continue the discussion to the next meeting?
I'd like to make a motion to continue this discussion at our July Planning Commission meeting.
I'll second the motion.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed?
I'm sorry, who seconded the motion?
Stephanie.
Thank you.
So is the hearing and the discussion continued, or just the discussion?
Just the,
Well,
It's just a discussion.
just the discussion, right?
Okay, so
Because we already
so I don't
published
know
the
if we
public
closed the
hearing.
public
I
hearing.
did close it.
She did.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Okay.
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so moving on to business item G, public hearing for the zoning map revisions. Was somebody going to talk about this first? or-
I'm going to talk about it
Okay.
first. I just wanted to make sure the microphone was on.
Okay.
The zoning map revisions were also discussed at our previous planning commission meeting. These are several non-major corrections, mostly, that the staff wanted to make after our big update where we rezoned everything in the city, which was adopted in March. Going through them as they appear on the maps in the back of your packet, our intention was to change all of the churches in the city from whatever their underlying zoning had been in the previous zoning map, and they mostly had residential zoning, which isn't really accurate for what their use is, and it also kind of messes with the way that we calculate our residential land capacity. So churches were intended to all be zoned to civic and institutional, and there were a few that I missed. So Bethany Lutheran Church on Tremont was supposed to have been civic and institutional. It remains R2, and I will be rezoning it from R2 to civic and institutional. The Christian Life Center on Bethel, which is what Pastor Virgil here is here to speak about, this one was actually requested by the church. The Christian Life Center is only on one parcel at this time, and the other two parcels are undeveloped. And so what they would like to do is to have the option of being able to sell those undeveloped parcels if they wish to in the future, basically. So the church itself would remain civic and institutional, but the other two would go to commercial mixed use. And that way, that would give them the widest flexibility for future development. It could be apartments, it could be commercial, it could be a mix of the two. It just gives the church their greatest number of options. And so Pastor Virgil can speak to that during the testimony part of this discussion. Christ the Rock Church on Old Clifton Road, McCormick Woods, that also was missed by me, and that should be civic and institutional. Instead, it was R3, so that will be another correction just to give that the correct zoning. And then the properties up on Mitchell Avenue, or between Mitchell and Bethel. These are a number mostly of small, older lots. Most of them have single-family houses. There's a few duplexes, a few small apartment buildings in here. Some of them are developed, some of them are not. And what we did when we rezoned everything in March we tried to give people a number of options for future use in their properties. Like I said, there's a mix of multifamily and single family here, and when we rezoned this, we gave this area largely a residential R3 zoning, which would allow people to build apartments. Several people, R4. Several people had expressed interest in coming in and doing some apartment type development in here. But then we realized later on, most of these are quite small, and you really can't get an apartment building in here. Not with the parking and the landscaping and the other infrastructure you need for this type of development. And R4 means you can't do duplex and triplex, which is really more suitable for these small infill lots. And so it made sense to kind of downzone these again to R3, which gives the people on these small lots the ability to do duplex or triplex and, you know, actually get something out of their lot other than single family. So I've actually spoken myself to 3 or 4 people who were supportive of this. In fact, another 2 people came in who didn't quite understand what this was for, but when they heard about it, they also said, okay, that's great. That's what we were wanting to hear. So everybody that I've spoken to about this sounded quite supportive. We also had another couple of corrections on here. I did not know we had Mitchell Park here, this little tiny green space in here. Didn't know it existed, but it does. It's a city park. And instead of being R4, it should be Parks and Recreation zoning. And the city public works property that's down here on the south end, I did not know that was a city public works parcel, and so it should be going from R4 to civic and institutional. It's in the same category as a church, but it has the same zoning. So these are all corrections. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to go through it.
Where is this little park? I'm picturing, okay, so,
On that last map,
yeah, I
it's
see it, but I'm
right-
trying to picture it.
There's just, I think there's a little bench
There's
on
a
the side of the
bench.
road that was in
Yeah.
the weeds for a while, and now we are maintaining it.
There, you see a bus stop sign, and then it looks like the bench belongs to the bus stop sign, but it's actually a park.
Oh, Alligator, okay.
The bench. I know, we could have a picnic there, but I don't know if all of us would fit.
Yeah, it's postage stamp size.
I wonder how it came to be. That little
Donated the
tiny-
land.
Walking up that hill.
Get tired walking up the hill.
I'm sure making a park right here, this is where I'm exhausted.
I've walked up the hill and I was like, dang, someone put a bench there.
Smart.
It actually makes sense. I pushed a bike up it. It was really awesome.
You're supposed to ride it.
I didn't either.
So do you guys have any questions for her?
I do not.
I do not.
So, then, at this time, I will open the public hearing for the zoning map revisions for, we're just gonna call it zoning map revisions. Hello.
Hello, Virgil Brown, representing Christian Life Center. I'm the pastor there. And I would like to start off by saying, you know, thank you for the good work you're doing. The rezoning part of it obviously is a huge project, and our church was rezoned, I guess, earlier this year, and I missed the postcard. I missed the notice. And so we were doing a little bit of research, came about that it was rezoned to civic institutional, and then I came in and just clarified that there's 2 parcels that we'd like to keep commercial mixed use that the church has owned for one of it close to 20, I think it's 22 years, and it's remained undeveloped. So we're currently doing what you're doing, thinking, where are we in 5 to 10 years? Are we ever going to develop this? And so our board of directors is wrestling with, you know, do we put it on the market to sell, or are we as a church going to come up with a church use for it? And keeping it commercial mixed use does give us the flexibility of putting it on the market. Civic institutional very much narrows it. And so I just brought in and clarified, we haven't developed it. It's undeveloped raw land, and it's been that way since we purchased it. So with your support of zoning it back to commercial mixed use, just that undeveloped portion would very much be good for us, and it is our request that we can do that. So does that help?
Which piece is that?
There, I don't know if they would be able to see this on their map, the 3 parcels that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Should I just say the parcel numbers? Is that the easiest way to communicate to them what I'm talking about?
Tell me
So
where
it's-
it is.
It's just north of Walgreens on Bethel.
Yep.
These are the 3
Yep.
parcels. These
Yep, yep, exactly.
It's pretty overgrown right now.
Oh, okay.
It's on all blue,
Isn't there some wet,
all raw. These are the three we
There's a
want
house
back.
on one of them, but vacant.
aren't there some wetlands in there?
Yes.
Okay, so the church sits on the dark blue part, and then the red and white striped parts, those are the undeveloped 3 parcels.
Oh, okay.
So the church fully sits on those 3, and you were right, a year ago, those were residential, and we're in support of zoning us what we are, but it's just the undeveloped parts next to Walgreens and Staples
Okay.
is what we'd like to have commercial mixed use. That's the neighbors right to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah, I know. It's good.
Questions or anything I can say to clarify?
That's good.
So is there any indications of what your intentions may be?
I think we're 50-50 yet. I genuinely think it's probably going to be tested on the market, because to develop it, we still hold a mortgage on the church. And so that's what we're wrestling with. We're still paying off what we built. So then to develop some undeveloped property would be a monumental task for us at this point, even 5 to 10 years out. So I think we as a church may put that on the market, but don't tell anybody that goes to my church, because we haven't made that. Edit that. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you guys very much.
All right, so seeing no other audience members, I'm going to close the public hearing for the zoning map revisions.
I'd like to make a motion to accept the zoning map revisions as presented
And recommend them to the city council for
and
approval.
recommend them to the city council for approval.
Did you, who seconded it?
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Nope, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
All over this Robert's
So do you want to go back to the remainder of the development regulations?
No, we're done now. We've reached the bottom.
But Doug's here.
We just skipped through the entire agenda. You guys want to go have drinks?
Yeah, there we go. Okay, we'll move back up. So we will go to business item C, public hearing, development regulations update.
And Doug, your items are first, so you may want to speak to those.
I thought she, okay. I thought she was doing the public hearing part first. I don't know.
Did you want to have a discussion of the regulations first, or did you want to open and close the public hearing?
I can open it.
Okay.
So at this time, I'll open up the public hearing for the development regulations updates. Seeing no audience members, I'll close the public hearing. Okay,
Okay, so there are 3 items within this presentation, and just to dispense with the simplest one first, the enforcement provisions and penalties. At the last meeting, that was presented, and the commission made a motion to accept them as presented with amendments and recommend approval to the council. So this has already been moved on. I just wanted to bring this one back and just share the corrections that were made, and they're specifically the corrections that the commission requested. And
Which one is this?
this is the enforcement provisions.
Okay.
So the Title 20 enforcement provisions and penalties. And
So this is in reference to the residential yard garage sales, et cetera?
this is not those two. This is just enforcement provisions.
I'm not seeing
I don't
Where is
see
that?
it.
There's no ordinance number at the top, so it
Oh.
looks blank.
These are in your packet in order of their titles, so I think this is going to be like
So it's the first ordinance that we
1,
have in our
2,
packet.
3rd in your packet.
So an ordinance of the city consolidating and standardizing enforcement provisions.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's the one.
Okay, okay.
Sorry.
One of these in the
So just within that, in the revised code portion, chapter 20-02-060, there were two changes in the first 1A from the words maintain and maintained to continue or continued. So there was a little confusion over what it meant to maintain a violation. So that was changed to continue. F under that had said that it was a violation to construct or use any structure or portion thereof in a manner contrary to any permit, et cetera. And that was redundant with one of the prior provisions. So that was struck and replaced with any violation of this title shall constitute a public nuisance. And then on the third page, which is chapter 20-82-040, the second provision there that said it is unlawful for any person to violate any provision or fail to comply with any of the requirements of this subtitle or of any notice or lawful order issued hereunder, and added to that is except as provided otherwise in this subsection. And those are the only changes to what the commission reviewed last month in that section. So I think we can dispense with that because that's already been moved and approved. The residential, what's next in order? Is it the vehicle or the yard sale?
I had yard sales
Okay.
next.
So the yard sale stuff, you didn't make a motion on and did not take a vote on, and I was requested to bring back some changes, and so you'll see on the staff report there, those changes are presented in red line and strikeout, and that was to clarify how professional estate sales fit in, seeing as how this was saying periodic non-commercial sales. So I revised that, periodic non-commercial sales and professional estate sales.
I have a question.
Yes.
Just going over this, on number 6 on all of them, when it says all goods, tables, canopies, tarps, and associated paraphernalia, I know it says associated paraphernalia, but what about the words and signs? Because they always leave their signs up. Is that redundant or just making it super clear? I know it's the paraphernalia, but I think it's a main thing that people really leave up.
The problem, and I did have.
Yeah, the sign
or,
code.
Yeah, I previously
sign
had
code,
something
but-
in there. I previously had something in there about signs, and I thought maybe we could kind of do an end around with the signs
Yeah.
because we're not saying you can't have yard sale signs out. We're just saying that as part of your yard sale, you
That's
have to
what I
take
was
your
thinking.
signs down. But it really does end up violating the Supreme Court ruling on the sign
Because of the
code.
verbiage, that it says it's a yard sale
Right, and
sign?
that was specifically one of the elements of that court case
Yeah.
was the requirement that certain signs be taken down at the end of an event.
But my question is, it is still represents what they're using, whether it's the verbiage or not. I mean, that is part of that aesthetic. So I don't understand really how it would be a conflict.
It's,
The content.
it's a really,
And that's such a,
it's a very difficult, I'll keep my personal opinions out of it, it's a very challenging court ruling, the way it was written.
so the
And
paraphernalia equals signs.
yeah, the way that Supreme Court ruling was written, it's very challenging to try to do anything where you distinguish any type of sign from any other type of sign.
Could you write like advertising?
I mean, the problem is we
It's
allow
again the
temporary
same
signs in the sign code, and so we have to allow temporary garage sale signs the same as we allow political signs or other ones. So, there's not much we can do as long as they comply with the temporary sign code. So taping something to a telephone pole, that's a violation of the sign code, and it doesn't need to be mentioned here. But if you have a stake sign in the ground that can be pushed in manually, I think is how it reads.
Right.
That's allowed as a yard sale sign.
But this is
It's-
talking about removed,
Right.
be removed. So
But it's-
when you
it's
say
kind
your
of-
advertising needs to be removed,
Yeah, it's along the lines of like political signs. We no longer can say that after the election you have to take your signs down. One of the Supreme Court rulings, the Washington State Supreme Court ruling, very specifically addressed political signs and the requirement to not have them up more than a certain length of time before the election, and the requirement to take them down X number of days after the election. And so even those, we had one that sat out here for about 2 years after the election, and we couldn't touch it because it was still, until it became dilapidated. It's, as I said, it's a very challenging Supreme Court ruling.
I'm gonna start a gang. We can't stop a private citizen.
Put the sign policing in business.
Catch you.
So, so then the other changes were, I had put in an option of limiting the hours to closing at either 6 p.m. or 8 p.m., and the commission preferred 6 p.m. for a closing time, and had not put any closing time into the rummage sale provision, and so that's added in there as well, so limiting to the same hours of 8 a.m. to 6 p.m.
Nice.
So that's all I have on the yard sales. So that one would be, we'd be seeking a recommendation from the commission regarding that.
I think what's preferable, I think, because there's 7 development regulation items, 3 that Mr. Price is presenting, and then I think 4 that Carrie and I are presenting. We'll do one recommendation on all of them, and if we need to continue one of them, we can continue one specifically and then move the rest of them forward as a recommendation.
Okay.
So were there any objections to the changes on the yard sales then? Okay.
No.
And then you have one more?
So then the tricky one, the vehicle service and repair. And in large part, and I apologize that the draft starts to get a little bit difficult to follow with both the blue and the red and the highlight yellow and the highlight gray. So I'll try to walk through this. Yes. Oh, may you have? Yes. I do. So the blue and the red are what was originally presented last month. So those are the additions and strikeouts from the prior adopted version of the code. And what I've done since then is trying to work with the areas of concern that were expressed last month. The yellow highlights represent some things that have additionally been taken out of that proposal, taken out of last month's proposal, or changed. And then the gray highlights are a few things that are added. And the primary intent here, there were 2 things. One was there was a provision in here that said that the work had to be done on driveway or parking pad that was immediately adjacent to the garage, carport, etc. And well, okay, what if my parking pad isn't, if I don't have a parking pad that's immediately adjacent to my garage, then what do I do? So I took out that immediate adjacency provision. And the other was just regarding what had been defined as major work, and the provision that said that major work could only be done inside an enclosed building. And so the impact on those people who don't have a garage to do the work inside of, and so on. The challenge is that in Port Orchard, we don't have a huge problem with this kind of activity, but there are some places where it is a problem. And without these provisions, I wouldn't have been able to deal with the one gross problem that we had on Bay Street. And similarly, the problems we have on Crawford, the further this gets whittled down, the harder it is to deal with those really serious problems. So what I've tried to do is cut down on what's considered major repair and taking out things like windows and seats and so on, and really boiling the major work that would be restricted to inside a building down to body work, framework, rebuilding engines, rebuilding transmissions, major assembly and disassembly of a vehicle. So I see basically a couple of ways to go, and one is to go with this. Another would be to say, okay, some of that activity, a little bit more of this activity could be done outside, but immediately adjacent to a garage or carport. And so then if you're gonna be out there banging on suspensions and all of that, you're right up at your garage, you're not out by the street. And then limit what's restricted to a garage to be just, body and framework and, just the most intense levels of activity. So I'd be open to some feedback on those options. If that's at all clear, it's not, okay. So the one option is to go with what's here, saying that major work is removal, installation, disassembly, or assembly of major parts and components, body and framework, rebuilding engines and transmissions, testing of alarms and sound systems, and say, yeah, that needs to be inside of a building. Or the other would be to pull a little bit of that back out and say, okay, you could do some of that immediately adjacent to your garage. So maybe you could rebuild your engine and transmission right in front of your garage, but the body and framework and stuff needs to be inside.
What about the sound system? That seems silly that they'd have to be inside.
Well,
I mean, that's putting in a stereo.
well, that's
he
why
changed
I
it.
changed
Instead of
it.
installation, he made it testing.
Yes.
Oh, I see.
So
I
yeah,
can
if you want to
my
install,
stereo,
Gosh,
but
good
I can't.
catch. I
Yeah.
did- sorry.
Well, because I
Yeah,
remember
if
I was
you-
the
Went
one
right
that
over
talked
me.
about
Yeah.
that
You
last
really
time
did.
because I'm like, I used to install stereos in my
Right.
car, you know.
Okay, yeah,
but
yeah.
if I'm going to be testing
I know Kathleen
an
was really
alarm,
yeah, so I
don't
pulled
want-
installation out. So you can install your stereo out in the front yard, that's fine. But if you're gonna crank it up and test it all day, put it inside the building.
right.
That's why he changed it. That's why he changed it.
Yes. Boats, RVs, and all of that.
So, that's why I was confused.
So, is this basically saying you can still do your weekend repairs on your car in your driveway? That's okay?
Yes.
Is that what it's saying?
Yes,
Okay.
as long as you're not doing this, this intense level of work,
Like dismantling your car and annoying your neighbors and leaking stuff all over the place. And
They want you to do that inside the neighborhood.
I do like the modifications that you made.
But why can't it, just have a limit on it? Like, you could do this, but it has to be done within 10 days.
It's not as long as it's not in a residential area.
I'm glad you took off windows and windshields as major parts and components, because I mean, I've replaced a window in my
Yeah.
driveway and.
Yeah, have Novus come out and fix a crack in your windshield, that wasn't the intent.
What about this place on Klein?
There's no limit.
On number 5, where we put the time limits on it, is that whether the work is being inside or outside?
Oh, 5 under 120?
Yeah.
Where's he?
That's a good
Work
question.
shall be conducted only between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. weekdays, 9 to 7 p.m. weekends.
That could be changed to outdoor work, and who cares what you do inside your garage, yeah.
Be my inclination. I mean, I've been known to tinker in my garage until 11 or 12 o'clock
Sure,
at night.
yeah. And frankly, I've been out working on the car, or doing other stuff on the car in the driveway till late at night, but it's not the kind of stuff that's going to disturb the neighbors. But yeah, that makes perfect sense to do outdoor there.
So, just to totally understand this, so I have a truck that I'm restoring and it's
Yeah.
outside, but it's on its, I mean, it's not tore apart or anything. Is that, so we're not gonna be able to do that after this? Is that what you're saying?
No, what this would say is that if you want to start, doing major, body and framework, depending on which way we go here, either that would have to be done inside a building, or we could pull a little bit of that out and say, yeah, you can do some of that as long as it's right up at your driveway, or, right up in front of your garage. But it can't be out by you can't be pounding and drilling and grinding and all that all day long out next to your neighbors.
So, I don't know this place that you guys are talking about. So do they have like more than one project going on at a time?
You wanna explain, or we can
Well,
explain it?
the particular one that a lot of this was written to address, a lot of the original version of this was written to address, was down on Bay Street at Mitchell Point. And that was one that had been going on for several years. And I had been trying to shut it down for a couple of years under the previous code. And that was all day, late into the evenings, sometimes till 11 or 12 o'clock at night, multiple cars, multiple people working on cars. It was someone who was buying cars at auction, bringing them back, parting them out. There were wrecked cars that he was buying at auction.
Point, where is Mitchell Point?
The way to an
It's, yeah, where you make the sharp right-hand turn, you go
the
past the
sidewalk
West Bay
disappears.
Center, you make that sharp, right-hand turn.
Goes up by the high school?
No, past that. So like, imagine you're driving to Whiskey Gulch.
Yeah.
When, as soon as it makes that sharp right turn,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
Mitchell Point,
Oh.
where the sidewalk disappears.
Oh. Is that like next to the old Blue Goose across the street? Am I there?
No, it's
way
further down.
It's further down.
By the city's wall.
It's, if you take that strip of straight road, the Blue Goose is on one end, and then that 90-degree bend is on the other end of that straight stretch.
It's there.
Is it by that charter company?
Yes.
Yeah, it's that point.
Yeah, Adventure Charters or something.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so there's a property there that had, and it's still tenuous as to whether or not he's actually completely stopped. But after he and his mother both got about $2,500 in tickets, because she's the property owner, it finally came to an end. But yeah, that was buying cars at auction, bringing them back, parting them out, taking parts, combining cars together. And it was all the time, weekends, evenings, nighttime, running
fire too, right?
engines. Yeah, and he had a fire because he was working on a fuel pump with an extra battery sitting there under the car, and spilled fuel onto the battery and burned up the car and almost himself.
And the fence,
And part of his boat and his fence. And then Crawford Road is the other real focal area right now, where that level of activity is going on the entire length of Crawford Road.
Explaining where it was.
Yeah, okay.
So,
So again, it's,
could you just limit it? I mean, I understand what you're trying to do, I get that. But this in no way takes away from just the guy that wants to work on his cars on the weekend. And, I mean, if you just limit it to you can only be working on one car at a time, or one vehicle at a time per property owner or something, I mean, I just would, and maybe this doesn't even do it, but I would hate to have the average Joe not be able to work on their car.
And that's, and I really have wrestled with that a lot in writing this, because I grew up with working on, we worked on our own cars all the time. I still do. And, we rebuilt engines and swapped out engines and things like that as needed. But that was, that might have been one, we might have done one engine in 10 years or something like that, and would be working on a car periodically. Whereas when you have these problem sites, they may only work on one car at a time, but they'll be working on that car day and night for weeks on end, and then as soon as that one's done, then they go to the next car, and then the next car, and the next car. And that's what this is intended to address, is those that are doing that level of activity, creating a nuisance. But yeah, it's trying to find that fine line. How do you not overburden?
Yeah, because I think most people are pretty responsible, the
Yeah.
majority of
And
them.
I think you've done a nice job of making this, I mean, you made a lot of changes from what we discussed last month. And I think you've done a nice job revisioning it. I think your intention of trying to make it user-friendly is there.
Because I'm like, my husband has a truck that he's eventually going to do something about, and we're not gonna put it in the garage and fix it. But,
I mean, I'm not really objecting to it, I just want to make sure that the little guy is the guy
Yeah,
that
and that's
follows
fine.
the
I
rules.
definitely want discussion on this, because I've not gotten a lot of input outside of this body, even from my colleagues in other jurisdictions. They just kind of, I just haven't gotten much feedback. So, so the discussion on this is very helpful.
Yeah, and I would add that, Doug is stretched pretty thin in code enforcement. There's a lot of cases that he deals with, and this is a tool that we can use when it's necessary. It's not something that we're seeking to use aggressively or all the time. It's, so we're not going out and policing neighborhoods looking for this sort of thing. It's-
Okay,
One other thing I did since last time is changed the multifamily residential complexes from 3 to 5, so that, if you live in a fourplex, you can still be out there working on your car. But you start getting into apartment complexes, and you shouldn't be doing more than just changing a tire, changing your wiper blades, that kind of thing, doing basic minimal maintenance in the parking lot of an apartment complex, unless you've got a garage. That very quickly gets out of hand when that starts happening.
I can see that, the little kids and stuff around, absolutely. So, no, I get that. Okay.
so that means the only modifications that we've talked about is the number 5, under section 20, the time limits. So 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekdays unless conducted in a garage or accessory building? The one that you brought up?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So I guess, we still have more to go. Okay. Do you have any more questions on this one?
No.
So I guess my final question is there a level of comfort with this as is, or would you still want to pull some more things out of that major work and make a third tier of?
I'm comfortable
I'm
with it.
comfortable too. I think that sounds
I,
good.
I think you've put enough work into it.
And this works for you? This does what you want, what you need it to do?
Yes, this definitely gives me the tools I need.
All right.
Cross that off your list.
So then we have other development regulations update?
So
Or is
if
that
we
just
are now moving on to the others that were not Doug's. If I remember correctly, we didn't really have a lot of questions at the previous planning commission meeting about these items, except for the tree canopy requirements, and this is the one that would be repealing significant trees and adopting a new chapter 2129 for tree canopy requirements in its place. And there were some questions as to how that would actually work in practice. And I put a copy of the existing tree, significant tree code at the dais for comparison purposes. And I know that, I think Kathleen had some questions about that in particular. Some of the other commissioners may have wanted to talk to Nick about that as well. Did you want to go over anything else other than significant trees versus the tree canopy code? Were there any questions about any of these other chapters, none of which have been changed since the last meeting?
The 9-lot short plats, that's pretty straightforward. Any questions about that? The minor land disturbing activity permits, any questions about that one? Or is that, that's not a separate item, right?
No, that's all.
Yeah, so that just had to do with correcting type 1 versus type 2 permit for, a tree versus multiple trees.
We discussed the on-site recreation space as well last month. It didn't sound like anybody had concerns with that requirement.
But I think that one ties in with the tree canopy ordinance, so I think that the two of them should be, I mean, tree canopy is one item, but the on-site open space helps facilitate some of the tree, the tree preservation goals. So anyway, I'm all ears for questions on the tree canopy chapter. Did you want just an overview of kind of why we're doing this, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so currently we have a significant tree ordinance, and that ordinance was passed at a time when Port Orchard had not annexed significant areas of undeveloped land. And so we had residences around downtown that were concerned that some of the big old trees would get cut down. And so they passed an ordinance that said, number one, you have to get city council approval to cut anything over 36 inches. And number two, to discourage people from cutting significant trees, they said you have to replace significant trees at a specific ratio if you cut them down. Where we've run into problems is in the areas that we've annexed. There's a site specifically up on Geiger, and we've received a subdivision application for that site, and it is entirely forested except for what the tornado knocked down. And so they have something like 400 significant trees on the property. The property has no critical areas, and so it's 100% developable. And the significant tree ordinance says that you have to replace these trees at a 3-to-1 ratio, which means that they have to find space for 1,200 trees on a site that already has mature 400 trees. And so how do you reconcile the Growth Management Act requirements of providing housing and using your land efficiently with protecting sites that are entirely forested? And so it's urban land. It's meant to be developed, and there's an allowance for up to 50 or so lots. But if you try to start protecting trees, number one, you're not going to be able to grade roads through the site because of the amount of grading that has to happen. It is a sloping site, and inevitably these trees are not going to be where you want them to efficiently place houses. I think if you tried to protect even 20% of the trees, you're probably going to cut the number of houses that can be built by 2/3. So the example that we were pointed to that was recommended to us, and we talked to PSRC about this, was Snohomish County and I believe Issaquah, one of the east side jurisdictions had taken a different approach to trees, and their goal was, we want to have a forested community long term, but we recognize that it has to be developed in the interim in a way where the trees are in logical places, and you're also reducing the risk of blowdown when you go in and you cut some trees and then you expose trees that were previously on the interior of a forest and now they're suddenly on the windward edge of a forest. Then you have a windstorm and half the trees blow down anyway. So the idea here is that you create incentives to protect some of the significant trees, and by having requirements for open space, if there are good significant trees, they may want to locate their open space where those trees exist. And you're really setting a goal saying in residential neighborhoods we want 30% tree canopy. But if you save some significant trees, we're going to give you a little bit of a bonus for the trees that you do protect by reducing the percentage of cover that you have to have, so that you can kind of shift the development away from those areas a little bit. So you get, I think it's a 3% reduction for every, or you get a 10% bonus. So if a significant tree today covers 1,000 square feet, you get credit for 1,100 square feet of future coverage. And so they have to prepare a tree canopy plan that shows what this is going to look like in 20 years once the trees that they choose to plant are mature, and it's going to show that you have 30% tree coverage. So you do get credit, and you don't have to pay for trees, and you do have to, I mean, the trees that you have to plant have to be, I think, 8 feet with, you know, and there's a list of species. So it is expensive to put in the trees. You're going to have to put in irrigation to support them. So there's a built-in incentive for retaining what significant trees you can, but the goal is really long-term tree canopy and allowing more logical development and better design rather than trying to deviate from big trees in a forested site. So with that said, if there's questions about this, I'm happy to try to answer those, but that's really the scenario that prompted this, is we said, you know, retaining a significant tree on a site that has lots of meadow or lawn is easy, but taking a forested site and trying to do this is really hard. The other thing that this does, you know, in conjunction with the landscape code, our landscape code requires buffers between uses, but there's really no requirement in our code for you to do anything in terms of landscaping. You have to provide a landscape plan, but it doesn't say that you have to have trees in your development. It could be lawns, it could be shrubs, it can be whatever you want. And so this does set some minimum standards for people to provide trees as part of their development plan and to get us a good landscaping plan while giving them the flexibility to choose how they lay it out.
It seems like it's gonna make it a more, you know, strategic, planned, and more environmentally friendly instead of just clear cutting everything and starting over.
Well, it allows that if that's what's necessary on a given site, but it creates enough of an incentive to try to save trees where you can and where it's
I
reasonable.
think that's great. Makes sense to me.
I think the one thing that we've always had issue with trees and with taking them down and replanting and the requirements that they were supposed to do is they really don't, I mean, you could say they have to have a 20-year plan, but let's say 10 years, they all die. I mean, are they responsible still? Yeah,
So-
or even a year. I mean, what happens with that?
So there is a bond requirement for landscaping plans, and so when you install required landscaping, you have to put a bond in place that's 125% of the value of the landscaping, and you have to put in at least temporary irrigation to make sure that that survives. And usually, a performance bond where they come out once or twice, you know, a year after the development occurs, and provided it's getting water, is enough to get things established to where it doesn't fail. The other thing that you saw in the earlier ordinance where we talked about code enforcement issues is that when you violate a condition of approval of a permit, it's a zoning code violation, or it's considered a nuisance. So if something does die, or if somebody goes in and cuts down a bunch of required trees, it is a zoning violation that can be enforced through code enforcement. So we just have to know about it and keep tabs on it. And once we have a landscape plan on file, in 5 years, if something changes or somebody goes in the file and sees a landscape plan and says, wow, what happened to all this landscaping? You know, that's an enforceable code violation that either the HOA or somebody else can be made to correct that.
How long does that bond last for?
Typically, it's a 2-year bond, but in some cases, we do have 5-year bonding requirements, but I don't know, I don't think that would apply here.
And I can say that it's one of those areas that I hate to do enforcement in, but I have had to do enforcement on required landscaping that's either been taken back out after a few years or allowed to die.
Nick, are you hoping for this to be included in the pack this evening that gets recommended to council?
Well, I mean, it's not gonna hold anything up. If we wanna discuss it more, we can move the other items forward without this, but,
I only ask because I was actually out of town last week and I had my mail held and it wasn't delivered till today. And I had not yet even had a chance to open it, so.
yeah, we can continue the tree canopy portion to the next meeting and move forward with everything else. I mean, that can be how you word your motion.
Okay.
More questions while we're at it, and I would like another look at this too, so. Especially now they have a better understanding of how the old one and the new one fit together. On the table with the tree canopy coverage requirements, any idea how they came up with those numbers from 15% to 30% coverage?
No, I mean, this was straight out of what, the code that we modeled this after. So,
Was there a method to the madness on the numbers, or were they just picked out of thin air?
good question. I could call my counterparts in Snohomish County and ask them where they got the numbers.
I mean, if there's a logical explanation, great, but then if not, then I think it might be something to revisit and see, are we?
Yeah, or,
do
I
we
mean, you
wanna
could
keep those
propose
percentages?
increasing this if
Right.
you feel that the numbers for certain types of development should be higher.
So knowing their reasoning would be nice, and might be something for us to look at closer.
Sure.
Were these before?
So is this only for new development, or is it also for existing homes?
This is for existing, or no, this is for new development,
Okay,
correct. Which the significant tree only applied to new development as well,
okay.
unless it was a tree over 36 inches, which previously required city council approval, but we let them off the hook of that. It just says that trees over 36 now have to be replaced at a 4-to-1 ratio, I believe is what the current code says.
Okay, you know, because I ran past a house this morning that used to have a lot of trees in front of it, and I was really sad to see a bunch of stumps.
Yeah. Yeah, that was the strange thing about the original significant tree code that was in place since at least 2007, was it said that you're not allowed to cut trees, but it said this chapter applies to when a permit is sought. There was no way to actually enforce it outside of a permit process, except for the 36-inch tree when you have to get city council approval to cut it. And even then, it was still in a chapter that was totally connected to permits, so it was a very strange provision.
Are we tabling that one till next?
So what's the next one?
So the residential open space requirement, just real quickly on that, we realized that we had residential open space requirements for multifamily housing, but we lowered the minimum lot size in the new zoning code, but there's actually no incentive in the new zoning code to create usable open space, so we wanted to make sure that this was a requirement of new subdivisions to provide, a sufficient amount of open space. Previously, when you had an 8-unit per acre standard, people would typically build some small lots and then have a remnant left over that they would throw a tot lot on, and now it seems like they need a mandate to do this rather than previously they had more of an incentive based on a units per acre standard.
All right, what's next?
So do you need a suggested motion on that one?
On which exact one?
So I
On
think what you
this
would want to
one.
do is recommend approval of all of the ordinances amending the development regulations except the tree canopy ordinance, which will be continued to the July Planning Commission meeting.
So I had a suggested motion if you want me to just.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
I move to approve the development regulations amendments except for chapter 2129 with changes to chapter 2066 as discussed.
And 2066 is the vehicle one, right?
Vehicle, yeah.
Ooh, I like that. Can we just say ditto?
You say so moved.
So moved.
Question. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Okay.
Thank you, Carrie.
Thank you.
Yes, that was lovely. I'm like, do
I
I
don't
have to
think-
mention
where am I
each
gonna start?
section, or?
So moving on to E, public hearing, 2019 comprehensive plan amendments. I will open the public hearing. No audience members, I'll close the public hearing.
the 2019 Comprehensive Plan amendments, we also went over this at the May Planning Commission meeting. These are very simple amendments, primarily intended to bring our comprehensive plan up to date for the year. Our 6-year transportation improvement plan has been updated to the 2019-2024 planning horizon. So therefore, our Appendix B, which is our plans adopted by reference, has been updated to include that update. The Bethel-Sedgwick corridor study plan was completed in 2018, and that plan was added to Appendix B in 2018, but we did not include the appendices, A through F, of the study plan, so we are revising Appendix B of our comp plan to include those appendices by reference as well. And then PSRC has adopted terms that apply to the different types and sizes of local centers, and we have a number of those. We want to make sure that our terminology remains consistent with PSRC, and so as PSRC has revised their terminology, we are now going to change our terminology so that our local centers will now be countywide centers and local centers in accordance. And we've also been changing the size of those to more closely correspond to what their requirements are. And so you have a map back here that shows the existing and future map as well. And we discussed the reasons for those size changes, and then the new center, which is proposed in the Annapolis area. And the terminology that will be changed throughout here, just to kind of bring everything up to speed that has happened with our comp plan update in 2016, made sure that everything in the land use plan that relates to countywide centers and our local centers is now going to be correct and consistent with what we're trying to do with Vision 2050, our next planning round. And also, I think what we're going to do for City Council is also go through the rest of the comprehensive plan and make sure that all other terms in the rest of the comprehensive plan are consistent as well.
Correct. We found a few references to centers of local importance, which was the old term in our transportation plan, and so that's just clerical corrections that we have to go through and scrub and make sure we've fixed.
Right.
I just wanted to speak a little bit more about the centers amendment. The Vision 2040, if you remember from our last comprehensive plan update, that's the regional vision, the regional growth strategy for the 4-county region, King, Snohomish, Pierce, and Kitsap. And so when that was written, it included a center's approach to growth. And as we're moving, they're currently getting close to finishing Vision 2050, which there's going to be a public comment process later this summer. The City Council has discussed this quite a bit already this year, but they're deciding how to allocate the next 30 years worth of growth, which they're saying from 2017 through 2050, we have to plan for 1.8 million more people in the region. And so Kitsap County is supposed to take about 5% of the region's growth based on the draft that's currently released, and that's roughly 90,000 coming to Kitsap County, and then it'll get split up to various jurisdictions. In between Vision 2040 and Vision 2050, the PSRC wrote a center's strategy for how we want to really direct most of this growth into our local, countywide, and regional centers. And so Bremerton and Silverdale are the regional centers. They're the highest hierarchy of centers. Below that is a countywide center, which we are proposing to have, I think is 8 of them in here?
Yes.
There's 8 countywide centers proposed in Port Orchard, and then there's local centers, which are the lowest tier of centers. And so centers are prioritized for growth and are also prioritized for funding through federal transportation dollars. So with responsibility for growth comes the incentive to plan for that, which is access to transportation funding. And so these are the areas that we are really, in our next comprehensive plan update, going to be focusing on what infrastructure is needed and how do we get that infrastructure into our plans. And in terms of our zoning, which I think we've already done with this most recent update, are these areas really zoned to accommodate the level of growth envisioned? And so I just wanted to make sure that you understood that this terminology corresponds with a priority in funding. And so the countywide centers are the highest priority, they're below regional, which we don't have a regional center, but for us, they're our highest priority for federal funding. And then the local centers are the next priority. And if you're not in a center, it's a lower priority, and those projects just don't compete as well in terms of seeking federal money for transportation. Not that there's a ton of money for federal transportation money right now anyway. But that's really the reason that we're doing this, is we're syncing up our terms with what's in the PSRC documents for the next comprehensive plan update.
Just out of curiosity, under goal 10, its old title was struck. I'm just wondering what the new replacement title is.
That's weird.
I'm not sure.
I mean, given that the actual bulleted lists are not deleted, I think maybe the intent was to delete the reference to downtown overlay district because it's no longer called that. But,
Let me go back and take a look at the historical version
yeah,
of this
we'll,
to see what we were thinking.
we'll clean
with
that
the
up.
notes
I
in.
don't think it's a substantive amendment, but it's gonna read strangely if it's starts with a parentheses and a lowercase currently.
Were there any other questions about any of the comp plan amendments?
Any further
I
questions
know,
on
I'm
that,
like,
or?
is everybody just waiting for me to do it?
Yep.
I'll make a motion to approve the 2019 comp plan amendments as proposed, with the exception of the one amendment.
Correction.
Correction.
Under goal 10.
Yes.
That one. I'll second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? So next up is the minutes.
Well, I'm on a roll tonight, unless you see
I just
something.
had, just for clarification, under business item B, if I recall, I had, try to refresh my memory, I had to chair the meeting last month, correct?
Yes.
Yes, thank you.
Oh, yes, so you couldn't have
Okay,
seconded
so
the
I
motion.
couldn't have seconded. So I don't want to take somebody else's thunder away, but I think under the, let's see, under the business item B, where it states that I seconded the motion, it's actually somebody else. But I don't know who.
You know, it's always hard when we're in the other room because I can only hear voices.
Does anybody remember seconding that?
It was either me or Kathleen.
Well, who was closest to you?
Was it unanimous?
I think it was Kathleen.
Yeah.
So it was Kathleen.
Which one of you wants to be on record?
It was probably Kathleen. I'm the one who made the motion, so don't look at me. It's really easy.
Oh,
I make motions.
so,
I don't remember seconding it, but I think it was Kathleen.
I think it was Kathleen.
But I'll just change it and I'll bring it back corrected for next time.
I'm pretty sure it was her.
That's what I thought too.
Okay. And then one last, under adjourn, I had to leave the meeting early, and I don't recall, is this, at 7:36, is that when I left and then officially adjourned, or did somebody else adjourn the meeting? Do you recall?
I thought we all left together.
Did we? I thought I had to leave early. I know I had to leave.
Yeah,
early.
you left early,
Totally ducked out.
but
I prefer leaving early.
I don't remember. I know the rest of us all left together. I went out the back door.
We didn't last that much longer.
Yeah,
I
it really
think it
didn't.
wasn't really officially adjourned, if I remember right. It just kind of dissolved.
We had no chair or vice chair after.
Yeah, it just
like
kind of,
5 minutes. We
it
also
kind of
didn't have a
dissolved and
flag.
was adjourned on the way out the door.
Ah, one of those. So how would you like to edit that?
The meeting was adjourned.
Perfect. Scratch my name, the meeting was adjourned.
Matter about the location?
Or the person, because I didn't adjourn it.
Okay. The meeting was adjourned.
Does the location make a difference
It
where it
does.
says
I
it's
will
done here in the
correct that.
chambers?
Yep, I will change it. Okay.
You guys just-
On it.
So we're putting those till next time, when they're all corrected, or are we?
No, we still approve it now.
Oh, okay.
With the
I guess
the
so.
amendments approved, yeah.
Okay, I'd like to make a motion to approve the minutes with the proposed corrections.
I'll second that.
Okay.
For the May 7th meeting.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? I have a question.
Say aye, I missed it, sorry.
What?
Nothing.
Are you abstaining?
No, I just
Were you gonna say
forgot to
something,
say something.
Did you want to say something?
No, just aye.
We're losing it here.
Do you have this much fun with the city council?
No.
Oh, I never go to council.
Nick?
It does.
My question is, who puts up the signs of the population count?
We update them every June. I just, on Fremont, that got put back up, that didn't get updated because it was taken down this last year.
Yeah, it's like 1390 on this side and 1410 on the other side of town.
That sign had been removed when they updated them last time, and so it'll get fixed after June when the new OFM number comes out.
Okay.
Any other announcements or?
No, do you have any good announcements? Anything exciting happening?
I will tell you that one thing we are going to be bringing forward to the planning commission, I don't know if you told them about the Sydney Sedgwick area. One of our goals has been to write sub-area plans for each of our designated centers, and we have started on the Sydney Sedgwick area, which is where the apartments are at Albertsons out near Lowe's. And so that area, we're just starting to do some master planning on, and hopefully we're gonna be bringing that through as kind of an urban design exercise and looking at how we apply our new code and maybe fine tuning things a little bit more for that geographic area. So look forward to that in the coming months, and anything else we're doing
For July?
at all? There's a lot of development going on now. I know we did a driving tour a couple of years ago. I think Trish got us a nice van, but there's a lot of projects.
I don't have it anymore.
Yeah, there's a lot of projects in the pipeline that, if you're interested, I mean, I don't know if, I think at Economic Development in April, I reported that we had, excluding McCormick Woods and what's happening downtown, we had like 1,800 units of housing in the pipeline of projects that are interested in coming in.
Good lord.
It would be fun to go on a tour again. But, and doesn't the city have a bus?
I think we do, yes.
Because I think 2 years or 3 years ago, we took that when we.
I don't know who has the keys to that anymore or where I get it.
Bill was our driver last time.
Yeah.
So now, so we no longer have the community service worker contract. It's completely in-house at the city. So you would just need to ask Public Works, because the same person, was it Bill who drove us, or was it my employee?
It was Bill that drove us.
I thought it,
I totally missed this one.
I thought it was my employee, and he's now the
No, I
city's
think I
employee.
drove. I think I just
You
went and
drove?
got it, yeah.
Okay.
No, he drove with the mayor when we went with the council. This was when just the planning
Oh, yeah,
commission
you guys
went.
went alone.
We went by ourselves. We prefer to be by ourselves.
It's too bad we don't have electric scooters. We could do like a little scooter tour.
That would be fun.
Segways, do we have a budget for that?
Do you guys know who's in charge of the housing authority? Housing authority?
Which one?
I don't know, one that would deal with people in Port Orchard is my.
That would be the Housing Kitsap, and that would be, Norm, right?
No,
No?
What's
No,
the director's
Stuart.
name?
Stuart
Stuart, yeah.
Grogan.
Stuart.
Stuart Grogan is the executive director of the Kitsap Housing Authority, or Housing Kitsap.
Thank you.
I would just like to comment that the new Rockwell Pocket Park looks really nice.
It does.
It's so nice having that boardwalk extended. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, it is lovely.
Is there gonna be an official ribbon cutting?
The ribbon cutting is June 14th. I took a break this morning and walked it myself for the first time all the way down, and it was,
Very nice.
my goal is take a break every day this summer and walk the path and
That'd be a good goal.
get fit.
And
And
cutting at.
I don't remember, I think it's afternoon. I know that I have a conflict, so I won't be there, but I
Yeah.
believe it's June 14th at 2. But check the city website, I think they'll have a notice. The McCormick Park also, I don't know if you've been out there since it was finished, but it's really nice.
I think the last time we were out there is when you drove us out there.
Oh yeah, if you haven't been out to McCormick Village Park, I mean, it is, good luck finding parking. It's crowded and very actively used.
Fantastic, good.
All right, on the handlebars of yours. Hey, can we get a
Adjournment?
what?
Adjournment?
Yeah, well, we're adjourned.
adjournment.
We're adjourned, sorry. Sorry. I just wanted to know if we could get like a contact list of, we used to get a contact of who was who and their phone numbers. and-
year.
Yeah.
You mean like a roster of
We can
everybody?
harass each other on
Yes.
the weekends?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
As we refresh our rules of the planning commission about talking about business and quorums and other things.
Yeah, but just remember, when I send this out to you, this is something that is exempted from public record, so please do not share it.
What?
Right.
It's not a public record, so don't, like,
So I can't just
Send it
publish your
out
guys'
to-
home
Contacts?
phone numbers.
You're saying the contacts.
Okay.
yeah, it's like if somebody called me up and said, I want all the home addresses and phone numbers of the
Well, I
planning
wasn't sure, you
commission,
know,
I couldn't give that out.
Oh, no, I wouldn't share that with anybody.
Yeah, okay, I'll send that out tomorrow. Have you adjourned?
Yeah, I did.
Oh,
Sorry.
okay.
Because it may not, I mean,